Okay, well, good afternoon. I am Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and I am delighted to welcome you to this filmed presentation of a new series, a three-part series on the history of the U.S. Constitution. For those of you who read your programs and your Explorer newsletters and the OLLI catalogs very closely, but maybe don't read the emails that I send out periodically, you're going to look at the podium and say, that doesn't look like Professor Delahunty to me. Well, you're right. The speaker, Professor Robert Delahunty, who's in your written publicity material, was not able, had to withdraw from this series at the last moment. So his colleague, Professor Teresa Collett of the University of St. Thomas Law School, has so graciously and generously offered to step in at the very last minute. We are so much indebted because I had just come back from vacation and I got this emergency email, your speaker has canceled, and I thought, oh, what do I do, you know? And fortunately, what I did was I spoke to Professor Collett and I realized I should be standing over here and not in front of the screen, right? Okay, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Collett, and I also want to say just a couple of other things. History programs at the Ramsey County Library are made possible through the generous financial support of Minnesota's Fund for Arts and Cultural Heritage, which was passed, came into being through a voter amendment to the Constitution passed in 2008, the Legacy Amendment. We're all very grateful to the voters of Minnesota for that. And I want to acknowledge our ongoing partner in these series, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota. So having said that, I am now pleased, very pleased, to turn the podium over to Professor Teresa Collett. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. My colleague, Professor Delahunty, sends his regrets. Judy is so meticulous in her planning that she contacted him before we actually got our fall teaching schedules. And he agreed, not stopping to think, oh, gee, I might be scheduled to actually teach law students during that time period. And so when he received that notice, he contacted Judy, and Judy was kind enough to extend the invitation to me. The differences in the presentation are both in style. I see a former student of mine, a lawyer, standing out there waving. He knows better than that. And a little bit different style and a difference in background. Professor Delahunty teaches constitutional law to our entering first-year class. He also has been involved in constitutional litigation a little bit longer than I have, but I teach our constitutional litigation class. So with Professor Delahunty, you might get a little more history. With me, you're going to get more cases, because that's what I do in part. I've been litigating cases involving constitutional provisions for over 20 years. And so that's the background I bring to this. Professor Delahunty, on the other hand, before he became a lawyer, was a professor of philosophy in England. So very different folks, but hopefully equally as valuable information. When Judy told me she wanted me to talk about the history of the Equal Protection Clause in the context of the 14th Amendment, I was happy to do so, but I will tell you, because this is a three-part series, you're going to really see much more of my expertise that last class if you'll just hang with me. Now, if we show up tomorrow, next class and there are 3 of you coming, then we can just have a general discussion. But today is really to talk about sort of the background to the 14th Amendment. And then our next class, we're going to talk about how the 14th Amendment was interpreted and applied, both by the courts and by various presidential administrations. And then the final class will be the controversies surrounding the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. So that's sort of our sequence of conversation for the next 3 classes, okay? So let us begin. Part 1 is, of course, on the historical origins of the Equal Protection Clause. And what I want to begin with is that we don't write on a blank slate. We write on the Constitution of the United States as it was originally enacted in the 18th century. And so many of you will remember from your college or high school history classes that the Constitution itself has no, the word slavery does not appear in it, but in its original ratified form, it had 3 provisions that dealt with slavery. Now that has led some historians to characterize it as pro-slavery, the original sin of our country. Some historians say that the Constitution represents a political compromise necessitated by a desire to create agreement among all of the original 13 states in order to pursue the Revolutionary War. And there's certainly a lot of truth in that. And because of that, and because of the sort of textual compromises we see in the document, they dispute that it's actually pro-slavery, but say that it is a document that recognizes the political realities necessary for the Union to continue. Now remember, the Articles of Confederation preceded the United States Constitution. That was our first national compact, if you will. And it proved largely to be ineffective. It proved to be ineffective because it allowed states a great amount of autonomy in making decisions about whether they paid taxes and making decisions about conducting foreign affairs, the sort of things that seem to be inherent in national sovereignty. The federal government, and George Washington suffered from it, simply cannot operate without some revenue. Whether it's enough or too much now, I leave that to you. But at this point, right, in the moving from the colonial period to the early constitutional phase, the Articles of Confederation, because it was a compact among the states, recognized the power of the states to a larger degree than proved feasible or workable during the Revolutionary War. Now what's interesting, and one of my colleagues who enjoys being controversial, one of my colleagues claims that the Constitution is actually unconstitutional. And, in fact, he makes a good case. Because the Articles of Confederation, the first national compact that let us go forward with the revolutionary spirit, actually required 100% agreement by all of the states in order to amend the Articles of Confederation. And so, in what has now come to be called the Constitutional Convention, the directive from the states through the national government was to prepare amendments to the Articles of Confederation, not to replace it. And by virtue of the disagreements that arose during what we now call the Constitutional Convention, it became quite clear that it would be impossible to get 100% agreement among all of the states. And therefore, in proposing the new Constitution, the call for ratification reduced the number from full agreement by all the states to a particular majority. I believe it was 10, but, oh, okay. That's not a question, that's a lights motion. All right. That's okay. And so as the ratification process began, it's also important to know that the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, as back then, today, requires the state legislatures or the states to vote. It cannot be delegated to the voters in the state itself. There's a U.S. Supreme Court decision that ruled that because it is a compact among the states, the state government cannot delegate it to the voters to referendum. And so at that time, they were very concerned about whether they were going to get the southern states on board, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a lot of negotiation. Remember, the Constitution, as first ratified, didn't even have the Bill of Rights, right? Because that was a point of dispute, but ultimately, through the Federalist Papers and continuing pressure, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we now know as the Bill of Rights, were passed to appease that. The arguments for those who didn't want a Bill of Rights was that the federal government, the powers of the national government, were only those that were expressly contained in the U.S. Constitution. And therefore, the idea that individual rights would in any way be reduced or minimized other than to the extent necessary to fulfill the powers of the federal government that were expressly delegated to it by the state's ratification was a phantom fear. It simply was unnecessary. We didn't need a Bill of Rights. Where our rights were protected as individuals was through the state constitutions. Okay. And so when Judy and I first talked, and it wasn't clear that Professor Delahunty had already laid out his topics, I said, oh, that'll be great. We'll talk about equal protection under the state constitution versus equal protection under the federal constitution. So maybe in a couple of years, Judy will invite me back if I don't bomb this time, and we'll talk about that. But state constitutions were seen then, and still today are by many people, as the first best protection of individual liberties. So, for example, under the Minnesota Constitution, we have a much broader free exercise of religion provision as interpreted by the Minnesota Supreme Court than we have under the U.S. Constitution. And there are a lot of other individual rights that, while some are hotly disputed, are provided for either by judicial interpretation of the Minnesota Constitution or are protected by the Minnesota Constitution independent of the U.S. Constitution. We'll talk a little bit more about that on day 3. Okay, so the U.S. Constitution gets ratified as the process of political debate and compromise occurs. And within it, in order to maintain the southern states or the slave-owning states' position of unity, allowing a national government to be formed in accordance with these broader powers that are going to be given to the federal government, a compromise was reached on the question of slavery. And there are 3 provisions in the Constitution as originally ratified that give us the background to the 14th Amendment and what was necessary constitutionally to correct what has been referred to as the original sin of this country. Okay? So the first one is the Fugitive Slave Clause. And in it, the Fugitive Slave Clause provides no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Now notice, we don't see the word slavery there at all, right? Again, the word slavery does not appear in the Constitution until the introduction of the 13th Amendment. Okay. So in the original document, as ratified, they use the euphemism of person held to service or labor in one state. That's their euphemism for slavery. And the consequence of that is that the question of whether a state will allow slavery within its domestic borders was determined by the states, but where states differed, there was a national obligation to honor the law of the state in which the slavery was authorized. Okay, so that's our first provision. It's Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution. The second provision that references it is that of the 3/5 Clause, Article 1, Section 2. And there was a huge dispute that many of you will remember again from your college political science classes or your high school civics classes. One of the 2 first questions that really had to be decided when we decided to have a bicameral Congress, right, 2-house Congress, was how was representation to be determined? Was it to be each state got equivalent representation? So North Dakota, which didn't exist at the time, would have the same representation as Texas or New York? Well, that's the way it works in the Senate, right? 2 senators from each state. But the second house, the people's house, if you will, should be proportionate to the population of each state. Okay, that then gives some balance between the differences in population. Well, how are we going to figure out the population of each state? Who counts for purposes of determining memberships in the House of Representatives, and therefore, certainly in the time that this is being crafted, in the ability to control the legislative and executive branches, okay? Because they were very certain that while it's not direct democracy, they wanted it to be representative democracy. And so this provision made the determination that representatives, the number of folks in the House of Representatives at the national level, and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included with this union according to their respective numbers. Okay, that would just be a head count. But they modify that. It's not just a head count of every human being in the state, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound for a term of years. Now notice how that differs from our prior language. These aren't people in service or labor, right? It's a narrower group, including persons bound for a term of years. What's that? Indentured servitude, right? Slaves don't count, but indentured servants do. Including those bound for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed. So if they were taxpayers, they got counted. And 3/5 of other persons. Okay. Now, again, on the third session, we'll talk a little bit about this, but even slaves were recognized as persons constitutionally, but only 3/5. And the ramifications of this in the political process is that in effect, for every vote of a free citizen in a non-slave owning state, or the North, a slave owner in the South who owned 100 slaves would have the equivalent of 60 votes. Okay? So even though the free population of a state like Massachusetts, at certain points in history, exceeded the free population of the state of South Carolina, because of the 3/5 provision, South Carolina got more members of the House of Representatives because the vote of one free person in a non-slave owning state could be the equal of one free person and 60 others if that free person in the slave-owning state owned 100 slaves. You can see how that alters the political composition of Congress as well as the political election for the president. So this is not one of those just insulting provisions, which is bad enough, but it had real political consequences for the abolitionists who were hoping, if they couldn't win in the Constitutional Convention, that they could win in Congress later. Okay, very real. In fact, I believe the number is in the first 26 presidents, 24 of them came from slave-owning states. Wonder how that happened. Okay. And then the slave importation clause. Now this is where the abolitionists were partially successful. And remember that the abolition movement was one of the grievances, or at least one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence, was that in fact citizens not citizens here, but petitions had been presented to King George that he stop the slave trade to the colonies. It's one of the listed grievances in the Declaration of Independence, and that he refused these petitions. Okay. So the debate about whether slavery should come to our shores was not simply taken up in the mid-1800s. It was taken up even in the colonial period of this country. The Quakers in particular were quite strong on this issue. And so during the Constitutional Convention, they were hopeful, at a minimum, they could get the same situation that they got with the Articles of Confederation, where there was simply no mention or any provision that could implicitly affirm or eliminate the institution of slavery. The Articles of Confederation neither affirmed nor eliminated. They lost on that. Okay, as we see, we have 3 provisions in the original Constitution that affirm the existence of slavery. Then the next question was, well, how long do we have to, as a country, accept this institution of slavery? And this is the compromise, because, of course, the slave-owning states wanted it to continue in perpetuities, right? It was a state's matter. It wasn't a concern of the federal government. We can make our own decision. The abolitionists wanted it gone when they crafted the Constitution. In the political debate, they resolved to adopt this: the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 3. Now, this distorted the political process in a number of ways. First, it encouraged importation of slaves, as many and as quickly as possible, because slave-owning states would be limited, quite possibly, they understood the implications of this, in 1808 from ever importing another slave. So they needed to have a natural population of slaves to continue to produce more slaves, all right? And so because of that, we see that in the Deep South, in the years between 1788 to 1808, more slaves were imported than any other 20-year period. It incentivized the acquisition of more slaves through the slave trade. And to that extent, those slave owners were right, because as soon as the Constitution permitted it, it was abolished by Congress, notwithstanding those Southern extra votes in the House of Representatives. In 1808, Congress abolished the slave trade or importation of slaves. Okay? So we see that in the original Constitution, we have 3 provisions that, while not creating a right to slavery, doesn't create a national right to slavery, it recognizes a pre-existing right for the states to make the decision of whether or not to allow slave owning within their states. Okay. Now you would think at 1808, when the slave trade stopped, maybe that would reduce some of the tension and debate within Congress and on a national level and between states regarding the institution of slavery. But you would be wrong if you thought that, okay? And the provision that continued to create political turmoil and ultimately, many historians say, contributed to the Civil War being a necessary political resolution of this, okay, was the Fugitive Slave Law. This is actually a replica of the sort of posters that you would see in various states. And it says, run away from the subscriber on the night of Thursday, September 30th, 5 Negro slaves. And then it goes on to give you a description, a Negro man, his wife, and 3 children. And it describes the physical appearance of the man, as well as the fact that he is known by the name of Washington. He's probably well-dressed, probably taking with him 1 ivory cane, and is of good address. In other words, he's educated. He will appear as a freeman in the North. And so beware, because Washington is really a slave, and we want him back. Mary, his wife, is about 30 years of age. She's a mulatto, so she's not going to have the dark complexion. And she's quite stout and strong. Okay? And then they describe the 3 children. These were not uncommon postings. This was posted in St. Louis, Missouri. Okay? These were common postings. And the question arose then in whether how do we interpret this practice of the fugitive slave law under the Constitution? And the constitutional provision allowed states to require proof of the slave status. So if Washington were captured, the states could require before the slave catcher, which was a profession during this time, the slave catcher could be required to prove that this was Washington the slave and that he was asserting the rights of the subscriber, the owner. So it was a two-part proof, right? Do you have the right guy, and is he owned by the person you say you're representing? Gee, that sounds awfully sterile, doesn't it? All right. But, and this is where every good cause needs a lawyer, it at least left a small loophole for the states to decrease this practice of slave catching and returning slaves into slave-owning territory. Because many states passed statutes, some even required a jury trial on these questions, relying on the sentiment of the local population that you'd get a jury dominated by abolitionists. And, well, that may be Washington, but that's not that Washington. And you've not adequately proven, okay? And so the states in the North really resented this practice of slave catching going on in their territories. And many of them passed laws that created procedural barriers to returning the slave to the slave owner, okay? This changed with the congressional passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. The federal law authorized masters of their agents to capture fugitive slaves across state lines and to bring them before a state or federal magistrate in order to obtain a certificate of removal. No more jury trials for you unless your slave catcher is stupid enough to submit to state jurisdiction. Just run right into that federal court and get your certificate. And the individual that purportedly was the slave was not allowed to testify under federal procedure. Many of you wonder why so many states have elected judiciaries, especially elected state Supreme Courts. What we find is a correlation between the enforcement of this law and the passage of state constitutional amendments and embrace of elected Supreme Court judges. Again, states resisting it, saying, our justices aren't going to send anybody back. We're not going to have our courts used in this way. Unlike the federal courts, where you had lifetime appointment, at least assuming you engaged in good behavior, which has led to almost zero, not all, zero, but almost zero impeachments of federal judges. Okay, so this is where at least many historians attribute this time period to the acceptance of elected justices and judges in the state court systems in comparison to the federal system, which is an appointed system. Okay? Well, the states were not happy about this. And so, as Tocqueville says, any question of dispute in the American culture is ultimately going to end up in court. And it did. So the first Supreme Court decision on fugitive slaves, Prigg versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, was decided in 1842. And by an 8-1 majority, they upheld the constitutionality of the 1793 Act. What was that case about? Well, the Pennsylvania legislature was one of those states that tried to provide procedural protection to people who had been identified as escaping slaves. And so they passed laws in 1788 and in 1826 prohibiting the removal of Negroes out of the state for the purpose of enslaving them. Because one of the other problems was that slave catchers would simply enslave freedmen, men who had never been, men and women and children who had never been slaves, and take them to slave-owning states and auction them off under the claim that they were catching people who had previously been enslaved. In 1932, a black woman named Margaret Morgan moved from Maryland to Pennsylvania. Although she was never formally emancipated, her owner of the time granted her virtually full freedom. His heirs, however, upon his death, wanted her returned as a slave and sent Edward Prigg to capture her in Pennsylvania. After returning Morgan to to Maryland, Prigg was convicted by a Pennsylvania court of violating the 1826 law that you can't take free men into slave-owning territories and auction them off. Prigg was unsuccessful in arguing before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that both the 1788 and 26 laws violated the constitutional guarantee of extradition among states and the federal government's fugitive slave law of 1793. So he lost, surprise, surprise, in front of that elected Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Wonder how that happened. The U.S. Supreme Court heard the case on appeal and ruled that Pennsylvania's law prohibiting the extradition of Negroes to other states for the purpose of slavery violated Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, violated the federal constitutional protection of the fugitive slave law. Protection for the slave owners, not protection for those identified as slaves. The Supremacy Clause assured that federal laws prevailed over state laws, a common argument made even today, and the decision did not wholly end asylum across state lines for slaves. Justice Story granted that state laws put in place by state laws to recapture slaves in free states only had to be enforced by federal officials and not state magistrates. So in other words, states were free to have laws like Pennsylvania's, and if you went through state courts, they were free to enforce their own state laws. But if you went into federal court, the federal court enforced a different type of law. And so the slave or the person purported to be a slave who won in the state court in federal courts was destined to lose. So you can see why when we talk about the Civil War as a war about states' rights versus federal government, it gives a whole new meaning to that, right? You have the free states rejecting the federal courts and the Congressional Fugitive Slave Act. And then when we talk about it in context of the Civil War, we typically assume that it's the states that were slave-owning states that are asserting their state rights. But both the abolitionists and those who supported the institution of slavery claimed that the states were paramount in this. And the federal government was taking sides. It was taking sides of the slave-owning states up until we get to the mid-1800s. So then we have a second Supreme Court case, Jones versus Van Zandt. 9 slaves lived in Kentucky and they escaped into Ohio to head north toward freedom, i.e. Canada. Van Zandt gave them a ride in his wagon. He didn't even intend to be a hero in this story, as so happens often, accidental heroes. 2 slave hunters gave chase and told Van Zandt and the slave, and took Van Zandt and the slaves to Kentucky. Van Zandt had asked for written proof that these people that he was carrying in his carriage were slaves, and the slave catchers couldn't produce it, but they orally told him that these people were the slaves which they sought. And because he continued and resisted the slave catchers, then the question became, had he done something unlawful in that instance? Van Zandt was charged with harboring and concealing slaves in violation of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. Van Zandt lost and appealed his case to the U.S. Supreme Court, saying, first, I had no written notice. I just had these 2 guys telling me this. I wasn't going to give these folks up just because 2 guys came up and tell me this. And number 2, I had no knowledge that they were slaves. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just was helping some folks along with my wagon. All right. He lost. The Supreme Court, he also lost. The court found that the fugitive slave law was constitutional as a valid exercise of congressional power under the slave trade clauses, the 3 clauses we've talked about. And while slavery remains a matter for the states individually to decide, each state could be free or slave as they decided through their political process, Southerner participation in the Union imposed a promise on the Constitution protecting the institution of slavery. In other words, which is pretty accurate politically, the Southern states would not have joined the Union but for protection of the institution of slavery, and therefore states were not free to disregard the pact with the devil that had been made. Pretty simple. There's logic and then damn logic. While slavery remained a matter for the states individually to decide, Southern participation was conditioned on this promise. The law did not violate the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Remember, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided that slavery would not go into those particular territories. That's why Wisconsin didn't have slavery. That's why, which the Wisconsin Territory was part of. Minnesota was part of the Wisconsin Territory at the time. And because we were a territory, that governed us, okay? There was no higher law that justified striking down a constitutionally permissible statute, that being the federal fugitive slave law, okay? Well, while all this is going on, you've also got the congressional debates going on. And every time a new state applied to join the Union, the debate would come up again and again and again. Does this state come in as free, or does it come in as a slave state? And so when Missouri applied in 1919, tension between the pro and anti-slavery groups boiled over. To keep the peace, Congress orchestrated a two-part compromise, granting Missouri's request to be admitted as a slave state, but also admitting Maine as a free state. So at least for Senate representation, you've got a free state and a slave state at the same time, okay? It also passed an amendment that drew an imaginary line across the former Louisiana Territory, establishing a boundary between free and slave regions that remained the law of the land until it was negated by the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. At the time, the United States contained 22 states evenly divided between slave and free. Admission of Missouri as a slave state would have upset that balance if it had been admitted alone. It also would have set a precedent of congressional acquiescence with the expansion of slavery. So the Missouri Compromise, while imperfect, as most if not all compromises are, was an attempt to at least avoid a worsening of the political balance between slave and free states at that point. Well, this led to the Dred Scott case. Okay. Most of you have some basic understanding of the Dred Scott case, and of course Minnesota, albeit while we were part of Wisconsin Territory, had some role in the story of the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave born in Virginia, and he was purchased by Dr. John Emerson in Missouri in 1820. Emerson then traveled with Scott to Fort Armstrong, Illinois, and then to Fort Snelling in Wisconsin Territory. Fort Snelling was in federal territory where slavery was prohibited by the Missouri Compromise. So it was a free territory, if you will. Scott and his wife stayed in Wisconsin when Emerson moved back to Missouri, and Emerson continued to lease Scott's labor out to people in Wisconsin, which also violated the Missouri Compromise. Okay, so he left Scott a slave, arguably, leased his labor out to other individuals, and then ultimately asked for his return. When Emerson moved to Louisiana, Scott and his wife joined the doctor and his family. The Scott's daughter was born in a steamboat on the Mississippi River, which technically made her, because it was a navigable waterway, a free person because she was born in free territory. Okay, so her status under the law was not unclear, whilst Dred Scott and his wife's may have been. Emerson ultimately died in Iowa, and I don't know what is with it with these widows, because they're the ones that usually prosecute these cases, all right? But his widow inherited Scott, whose services she continued to lease to others. Emerson's widow rejected an attempt by Scott, again, the accidental hero. Dred Scott did not intend to play the role in history that he played. He accumulated enough money of his own that he just tried to buy his family's freedom, okay? But she said no. And so that led to the legal action. In the case, Scott argued that his wife and he were legally emancipated because of their residence in free territories. Missouri courts had ruled in favor of similarly positioned slaves, but his case was initially dismissed because of a minor procedural problem. Eventually, the jury did rule in favor of Scott and his wife, but Emerson's widow appealed. Okay, again, those state jurors, you get enough abolition on them, and it doesn't really matter what the law is, all right? And so she moved to Massachusetts by then and given Scott to her brother John Sanford. Upon appeal, the Missouri Supreme Court reversed the trial court's decision and ruled that Scott was not required to be emancipated because he had failed to sue for his freedom when he was living in a free state. Now, if the court had left that opinion intact, that would open another door for slaves who were escaping to actually acquire citizenship in the free state. So if I can just get to a free state, I'll sue, I'll suddenly be emancipated, arguably. Now, the courts would have to debate whether, if they escaped, whether they were free slaves given the fugitive slave law, or did they have to be brought into the free state by their slave owner, okay? An important jurisdictional question at the time. I know I sound so antiseptic. I think the devil is a great lawyer. Okay, so, but that's the question, right? What is the trigger of this emancipation right if you get to a free state? Do you have to be brought by your owner, which could be construed as acquiescence, that you're effectively freeing them just by crossing the border, or could you escape and take advantage of the free status under the law? When Sanford moved to New York, Scott resumed his legal action in federal courts where diversity jurisdiction applied, which is how he got into federal courts and out of the jurisdiction of the Missouri Supreme Court that had not ruled in his favor. So the majority held that, and this is the opinion of Justice Taney, the majority held that, quote, a Negro whose ancestors were imported into the U.S. and sold as slaves, whether enslaved or free, could not be an American citizen, and therefore did not have standing to sue in federal court. Because the court lacked jurisdiction, Taney dismissed the case on procedural grounds. Now let's stop and think about that, because it was possible for a person who had entered the country through the slave trade, a black person who had come as a slave to this country, in some states, if emancipated, either by law or by consent of the owner, to be a state citizen. But the court goes beyond that and says federal citizenship is not possible regardless of your legal status in the state. Federal citizenship is not possible regardless of your legal citizenship in the state. That's another disruption of the natural sort of political process as we understand it today. Taney further held, he should have just stopped there. Well, he should have stopped before that, all right, but the really inflammatory part for purposes of the political debate was he went on to determine that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional. Congress had come up with a political solution, albeit far from moral, far from ideal, but isn't that true of so many political solutions? All right. Had come up with a way to avoid war. And in a case where it was unnecessary, because it already said, procedurally you're out, he reaches out for this question. It's like throwing a match on a pile of newspaper that's been doused with kerosene at the time. And forecloses Congress from freeing slaves within the federal territory. The opinion showed deference to the Missouri courts, which held that moving to a free state did not render Scott emancipated. And finally, he ruled that slaves were property under the Fifth Amendment, which is the federal takings clause, okay, and that any law that would deprive a slave owner of the property was unconstitutional. Okay? And that had been a debate that we had been having since the Constitution had been put into effect. Could a government be forced to compensate if they emancipated a slave over the objection of the owner? Because, for purposes of argument, that now emancipated slave was no different than the government taking your horse or taking any other live domestic creature that served you in certain ways and had economic value. Okay. Because I teach at a Catholic law school, I often say, please answer, the Holy Spirit may be calling. So I never have another phone ring the rest of the semester. I don't know if they don't want to hear the Holy, well, anyway, that's another topic. All right. So now let's look at, oops, sorry. Stop, go away, next. That's what we want. So let's stop and think about this, because we often look at the Constitution and these amendments as if they were written stone and have always been that way. But when we really think about it, the Congress was in the process of trying to figure out both a way to force the South to surrender and a way to modify the Constitution to undo the evil effects of the provisions that were written into the original Constitution. And that political debate was occurring during the Civil War, okay? So we see on this chart that the 13th Amendment, okay, it passed the House and therefore was certified for ratification by the states in January 31st, 1865. That's before the Civil War ends, okay? So now this was necessary because my students often wrongly think the Emancipation Proclamation did this. They're wrong. The Emancipation Proclamation only emancipated slaves in states that were fighting the Union, okay? It did not write into the Constitution the end of slavery. It was a military directive, because there were slaves who joined their masters in the battlefield as Confederate soldiers, sometimes in hopes of winning their freedom. And so the Emancipation Proclamation was as much a military attempt as it was a political statement on the part of Lincoln. Recall in the Lincoln-Douglas debate, and I'm a fan of Lincoln, so please do not misunderstand. But in the Frederick Douglass debates, Lincoln conceded that to hold the Union together, he would continue to tolerate the institution of slavery. And it was only when the war, which caused the largest number of deaths than any war we've ever engaged in, World War I, World War II, Korean War, take your pick. It was a bloody, dreadful, horrible experience. And Lincoln was desperate to end it. And the Emancipation Proclamation was intended to convert the slaves into insurgents in the South in order to gain their freedom, or to flip the Confederate soldiers that were slaves or freed black men in order to have them join the Union forces. Okay? It was a strategic move by Lincoln, and a good one, but inadequate as a constitutional solution to the problem of slavery. So it was ratified in 10 months and 6 days. I often ask my students, does the Constitution or any of its provisions apply to you individually or private citizens in any way? And invariably, they say, yes. Now, my own children know better than this, because as young children, they would say something using a curse phrase or something I found objectionable, and I would say, you have no free speech in this house. Let's just be clear here. I am the queen. All right. The only constitutional provision that is directed at private conduct is the 13th Amendment. All of the rest of them require what is called state action to trigger the constitutional provision. Okay. And we're going to talk about that again when we come to the third session, but just to give a controversial and a flavor of that third session. So example, the fact that some of the football players in the NFL are choosing to take a knee for whatever reason is not a constitutional question because they are employed by private employers. There is no state action. It may be a moral question. It's certainly a political question now, but it's not a constitutional question. It makes me crazy when I read those articles. Okay, so that was passed. Now notice we talk about these as the Reconstruction Amendments, as if they were passed in a package. They weren't. They weren't, okay? The 14th Amendment, which is the focus of this series, is actually the most controversial. And notice they didn't start debating it or it didn't get certified for passage until June 13th, 1866, after the war had been won. After the war had been won, okay? But what happened after the 13th Amendment went into effect were that the previous slave-owning states quickly passed a number of the provisions in the black codes that continued into effect into the 20th century, and also were terrorizing black members of their community. So these soldiers who had fought for the Confederacy, who were promised freedom, but knew how to use a gun, were deprived of their right to use a gun regularly in those states, okay? We could also talk about the Fourth Amendment some other conference. Okay, so, but that motivated, because as Northerners were watching what was happening in those prior slave-owning states, they were horrified. They were horrified. And so they decided that they needed to essentially constitutionally reverse Dred Scott. And that's what this is. It's a constitutional reversal of Dred Scott. The court didn't do it, I guarantee you. It was Congress and the states who did it. It defines citizenship, it contains the Privileges or Immunities Clause, the Due Process Clause, and the Equal Protection Clause. We're going to talk about that and how the courts interpret it and how was it applied. That's the next session, okay? And then, a little bit later, because that didn't seem to solve the problems either, they passed the Right to Vote Act, okay? So it was a historical progression. Part of it shows the influence or lack of influence for Abraham Lincoln, because every historian that I've ever read says that Reconstruction would have been very different if Lincoln had been alive. Very different. Whether it would have been more successful in racial relations, who knows? But it would have been very different. But under President Johnson, who took office after him, we see an increasing severity in the treatment of the former slave-owning states. Interesting footnote, those of you who are war buffs or law of war buffs. The United States in the Civil War was the first country in the world to recognize combatants on the other side as fellow citizens. They did not use any of the powers that international law at that time gave them to ignore the laws of war. They actually, granted, we can talk about the camps of Confederate soldiers that were starved to death when there were fields of grain around them, and we can talk about the Northern soldiers being killed wantonly on occasion. But as a matter of policy, the federal government under Abraham Lincoln extended the treatment to insurgents as if they were foreign military members and gave them significant international protections. Again, recognizing we must not be enemies. These are our brothers, as he said in one of his very famous speeches. Okay, so passed at different times for different purposes, growing out of the circumstances. Now, on your you've got that chart on the handout I gave you. It also notes that the actual end of the Civil War is somewhat disputed, and That was one of the things I learned as I was preparing for this talk, because I didn't know that. Like most people, I thought the Civil War ended when Lee surrendered at the courthouse of Appomattox. No, not formally. And it makes sense because communication wasn't what it is today. And so news had to get to all of the other generals to quit fighting, and it couldn't get communicated in order to do that. Actually, the state of Texas, or as they prefer, the Republic of Texas, was the last state in which there was a battle fought. And so the president's formal declaration that all hostilities were ceased was a couple of years after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Those dates are on your handout. In order to prepare for our next presentation now, I want to look at the actual text and talk a little bit about what it does and what the courts have focused on, and those you have in your handout. I tried to keep it to one page so that you didn't have a bunch of stuff. All right, so the 14th Amendment has 5 provisions, of which really now 2 are active. 3 of them are basically dead letter. The first is all persons born or naturalized in the United States. It actually gave us a definition of birth citizenship. Birth citizenship. Now, I'm a Texas import. I moved here from Houston about 15 years ago. And whether or not we should continue to recognize citizenship by birthplace was and is a hot debate there because of what are called, in some areas of the world, anchor babies. The idea that there are individuals from other countries who cross the national borders simply to give birth on United States soil in order to achieve citizenship for those children. So this is still the disputed question, whether birth is an adequate basis for citizenship. But we know that it would take a constitutional amendment to change that. And it's a fairly common practice throughout the world. Not all countries have it, but it's a very common practice. And subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge, this phrase we'll talk a lot about next class, the privileges and immunities of citizens. Now, one would think that that meant that it was reversing the Taney opinion that people who were imported for purposes of slavery could not be federal citizens, and that automatically, or at least their children born here in the United States, automatically would be vested with all federal rights and obligations. We'll talk about whether the court agreed. Of the United States, nor shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. Notice that differs from the Declaration of Independence. Pursuit of happiness didn't make it. All right? There are a lot of scholars that think pursuit of happiness actually meant property acquisition. They're obviously American scholars. Or without due process of law. And a lot of our focus next class is going to be on what does that mean? Is that procedural due process? Does all that guarantee us is notice that the government's going to take some action adverse to us and an opportunity to be heard? That's the definition of procedural due process. They have to let you know they're going to do something to you, and you have to have a right to be heard before they do it, okay? Or is there some sort of content to that? Are there certain substantive rights that are embedded in that we don't see in the text of the other Constitution? And in the third class, we're going to talk about things like right to marry, right to direct the upbringing of your children, abortion. All of the controversial social stuff gets crammed into that. Okay. Nor to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And the standard for equal protection today, and I think back then, was before something is unequal, you have to be similarly situated. Before something is unequal, you have to be similarly situated. So when your 8-year-old stamps their foot and says, well, why can't I go see that movie? You're letting my teenage sibling. The answer is, you are not similarly situated. There is no equal protection in this house generally, but certainly not in this instance. You've not properly invoked it. We're done. Thank you. Can you imagine being my child? All right. So we're going to talk about each of those provisions. Now that's Section 1. Section 2 was part of the victorious states ensuring that they got the political outcomes they wanted. And so representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. So this is to get rid of that 3/5 provision, right? The untaxed Indians still stay in, but nonetheless. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for president, electoral college, or and vice president of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive, i.e. president, and judicial officers of a state or governor, or the members of the legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state being 21. Notice we now have an age peg that we didn't have before, okay? An adult male of age 21 and citizens of the United States or in any way abridged, except, so everybody gets to vote that meets those qualifications. You're a 21-year-old male that's a citizen, unless you've participated in rebellion or other crime. You don't get to vote. You're disenfranchised. The basis of representation therein shall be reduced in proportion to the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. So all of the Confederate men that fought, that engaged in the rebellion, were disenfranchised. So when we say Southern states ratified these amendments, well, technically, yes. But they disenfranchised all Southern men. Women didn't matter. They were disenfranchised. Anyway, who had participated in the rebellion. Section 3. Now, that's no longer relevant, right? No person shall be a senator or representative of Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States, or hold any office, whether civil or military, under the United States or any other state. So they can't be governor, run for political office in their state, who have previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer in any state to support the Constitution, shall have engaged in the insurrection or rebellion against the United States. So again, Robert E. Lee, honorable man, not disputed. Disputed by some, but Northerners saw him as a man of honor. And yet, that was the end of any political engagement for him. Okay? Or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress, Congress can relieve that disability by a 2/3 vote. So if you're a properly rehabilitated former person that fought for the Confederacy, then if you've got friends in high places, i.e. Congress, they can rehabilitate it. Okay? 4, the invalidity of the public debt of the United States and authorized by law, including debts incurred or payment of pensions and bounties of services in suppressing insurrection, shall not be questioned. Okay? But neither the United States or any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of the insurrection or rebellion. Again, so they're cutting off all of the pensions, military pensions, and provisions of benefits to anyone who served in the Confederacy. Those 3 middle provisions are dead letter. We just don't have any Confederate veterans running around claiming their rights as citizens. So Section 1 and then this section are the 2 crucial sections that we'll talk about next class. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So when you see civil rights legislation, they often specifically invoke this power to show that it is part of the delegated powers of the federal government, rather than relying on some of the more amorphous language like promote the general welfare, which they often invoke for other types of legislation where they don't have clear text. This Section 5 of the 14th Amendment is the basis of congressional legislation in this area typically. So that's how we got here. We had people seeking to abolish slavery from, or at least got to the 1867. We had people seeking to abolish slavery even during the colonial times, petitioning the king, being unsuccessful. It was of concern enough it got built into the Declaration of Independence. The Articles of Confederation did not address slavery. It simply was silent on it, leaving it to state political process. But it didn't affirm it, didn't create a federal right to slavery, didn't allow the federal government, in effect, to be a part of that conversation. They also passed the Northwest Ordinance that did not allow slavery to extend into the territories. Then we have the new Constitution that has 3 provisions that do not create a right to slavery, but do have a pro-slavery impact, with the 3/5 provision, with the fugitive slave provision, as well as the apportionment. So all of those are issues of concern, okay? Those get resolved through the courts, largely in favor of the slave-owning states. The conflict comes in large part by Dred Scott. Remember that President Abraham Lincoln, in one of his inaugural speeches, says that if we ever surrender our rights to those robed to the court, that we shall have lost our freedom. So he was very much of the opinion that Dred Scott in particular applied only to the parties in front of it and did not create a general rule of law that would apply to all cases and that all states must respect. Okay. Then we have the North wins the war. The Confederacy is subjected to restraints on their political participation in subsequent actions. The amendments get passed, and from here we'll go into how have the amendments been interpreted through up until contemporary times next class, and after that we'll talk about contemporary debates. At this point, I think Judy told me I needed to open for questions, so let's begin.
Okay, and I'm going to bring the microphone around so that everyone can hear the question as well as the listening audience. I think I saw a lady with a, yes, there you go. Okay.
I think you would be a fun mom to argue with, but you would lose.
I would lose
No,
as the mom?
the child would lose.
Oh,
you would
thank
be
you.
a fun mom, but the child would lose. Anyway, how were women considered in the 3/5 law? Were they counted at all?
No.
Or so they were
Well,
totally
it was
discounted?
persons, so.
Right.
But
so,
no.
but were they counted as?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you.
I will confirm that because I didn't work on that question. And again, the contemporary stuff's my stuff, so let me make sure. I will make myself a note. Okay.
Regarding the 3/5 clause or law, are we to understand that the slaves really didn't vote? The vote was cast by the master? Is that
Absolutely.
Okay. I just want to clarify that.
Absolutely.
And I think I see some hands over here. That gentleman.
And let me drop a footnote. Remember, there were black men who had served honorably, had served, period, in the Revolutionary War. The vast majority of them honorably, just like the rest of the soldiers. So it's a very odd thing when Dred Scott says they have no possibility of being federal citizens, notwithstanding that many of them, were successful entrepreneurs at that point. It's a very odd ruling that was unnecessary to the opinion.
You've got questions.
Yes.
Could you explain the degree to which the Dred Scott decision follows the principles of textualism and originalism, which have been so much advocated in recent discussion about how to read the Constitution?
I think actually that would be a disputed point, because Dred Scott violated many judicial canons by answering questions that were unnecessary to answer. Once Justice Taney, and it was a majority opinion, quite strong, 7-2, once the majority found that there was no standing, the judicial canons, even at that time, like today, would require the court to stop any further inquiry. And so the standing question turned on constitutional text, but the further interpretations, I think, would be disputed as to whether they followed the original text.
How many of the ex-Confederates were ever allowed to actually vote or hold office?
That is a
And-
wonderful question
and
that I don't
wh-
know the answer to.
Okay. Okay. Did Reconstruction ending change any of this?
Absolutely. And you have to come back next week to figure out how.
For purposes of determining representative numbers from a state, women and children were counted as full persons for population totals, even though they weren't part of the voting group, right? And then like a 3/5 of a slave child would count, for instance, or?
3/5 of persons, and again, as I indicated to this question, I'm going to do some more research on that and come back, because this is Della Hunty's expertise.
Okay, I think I saw hands over here. I'm going to carry the mic over.
I was interested in your discussion that these amendments were passed by Congress still at the end of the war, or certainly after the end of the war. I hate to admit that I don't know the answer. What was the makeup of Congress at that time?
Well, here,
How were the representatives from the South treated?
here is the ratification vote on the 14th Amendment by state. And so you can see that Texas, which was the last battle, right, in the war between the states, as some call it, or the Civil War, as others call it, first rejected it and then accepted it. You see that the gray states were territories, so they didn't have a vote. Indian territory at that point still. And so for the most part, the representatives were not in Congress, or if they were, they voted with the majority. They ratified the amendment because, again, you deprived any political debate within the state on the issue.
I have a question on money. Almost everything boils down to money eventually. In the early clauses, you had $10 and $200 mentioned.
Right.
What's the current value of a dollar in a 1808 dollar?
I have
That would help us understand things, I think.
and I understand, but that's even harder than how many were subsequently re-enfranchised. So I don't. Do you
Can
know
I
that
say
answer,
something?
Judy?
I do not know the answer, but like any good librarian, I really know how to look up that question. So if you email me, Len, I will get you that answer very quickly.
And share it next class.
Oh, and I'll be glad to share it. Yes, next class.
I've got a new answer if I don't know the answer now.
Just on your previous slide with the ratification,
Yes.
I think there were just a couple of typos. Some of the dates looked like 1900s rather than 1800s.
Oh, there are some.
So that
Thank
may
you.
be
I
just
will
me and my
correct that
bad
if I
eyes,
ever
but
use it
I
again. Thank you
I
very
think
much.
there's a couple of typos in
All right.
the
Thanks.
colored one that you were looking at.
Yes, I was going
that
back
one.
to it. Yep.
Yeah, 1970. Yeah, so that's must be 18.
It was very late in California.
Definitely understand, but I thought you would like to know.
Thank you. I do appreciate it.
Another question? Who has their hand? Yes.
You had said that it might have been handled differently if Lincoln had lived. So was Lincoln in favor of all of those restrictions that were put on the people of the South? Because it seems pretty harsh if you want them to be your family and to be part of the Union. It seems like pretty harsh restrictions on some of them.
Certainly the speeches he gave toward the end of the war and prior to his death would suggest that he wanted them reincorporated into the national community as quickly as possible. How he would respond, though, to some of the prior slave-owning states' political and violent acts at the end of the war, we don't know. Because while Lincoln was, and is often perceived as a man of great generosity, he had also been our military leader in large part through the bloodiest war we've ever had. So I don't know how he would have reacted to the lynching and the growth of harassment, the taking of guns from black citizens for no reason at all. I don't know what he would have done, but certainly most historians believe it would have been a different type of Reconstruction.
this follows directly from that. It's my understanding that he was assassinated right after Appomattox. Then Johnson was president, and he was actually impeached over how he was attempting to enforce or not enforce these amendments. Can you comment on Johnson's role?
Sure. Johnson actually was discouraging ratification of the 14th Amendment. In his message certifying it, it was a very procedural message, and took the position that, you know, my duty constitutionally is to send this to the states, but the wisdom of this choice is questionable, et cetera. So he was actively opposing. Interestingly, the author of the 14th Amendment was a senator from Ohio who was part of the radical Republicans, and that's something that my students, I'm quite surprised that when they get to law school, they have no idea that it was the Republican Party that pushed all this stuff. And the Southern Democrats fought tooth and nail over this. And the radical Republicans were very punitive in their response. And Johnson, in part, was reacting to that, but he was also very sympathetic to the destruction that occurred throughout the country at that time. The impeachment process will be part of the conversation with the court.
Before I ask for the next question, I have to say that we have a crowdsourced answer here. This lady, Len's question was, how much would money in 1807, right, at the end of the importation of slaves, what would that be worth in modern dollars? So, according to the CPI inflation calculator, $200 in 1807 would now be worth $4,347.34. And I would like to thank this lady for that quick answer. Who has another question?
This is why I don't ban computers in my classroom. I want people to be able to do this.
You maybe had this on your Dred Scott, one of those slides, but what was the Supreme Court finding? I mean, what was the vote, the number?
7-2.
So it was really.
But remember the power imbalance, right? A slave owner with 100 slaves was 61 votes.
And actually, I have a question about just that point. Because at the time of the Constitution, not all white people, or white men could vote. Only property-owning white men could vote. Actually, wasn't the power of the Southern plantation owner larger still than 60? Because it wasn't. Do you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean, but that landowning requirement was found much more commonly in the states and continued in the states until 1950-something.
That was my question. We never know when did all men or all people get the vote as opposed to all property-owning people.
Let me make the argument for property-owning people.
Okay.
The other course I teach that I teach for our first years is property law. And so if we are going to increase a property tax, there is an argument under the theory of burdens borne that those who are going to have to pay the tax should have a say in it, whereas those who are not going to have to pay the tax should not have a say in it. And so while I'm very grateful for the participation of the humanities program, funding these lectures, I can imagine someone saying that that is not something that I want my property tax on my home to go up $2.48 because it's the 100th $2.48 request that we've had for the government, and some of it is to fund things that I think are just silly. In our neighborhood, we have stop signs that have leaves on them that are metal. We really do. And so every time I walk by those, I kind of think, So there is an argument that at least certain things should be limited to property owners. Now, I understand that's contrary to the Minnesota spirit, and believe me, moving up here from Texas, I encountered it full on. But I think there is an argument that when you are requiring greater responsibility for people in response to a legislative act, that they should have some say in it.
The act in 1808 that restricted or eliminated the importation of slaves, did that need an act of Congress, or was that part of the 1788 action, or did that need a separate act? And
It did need a separate act.
Okay, well then, if it did need a separate act, how do you reconcile that with the point that you made earlier, that
The 20 years they started buying slaves.
No, I just wondered what the political dynamics were in 1808 that allowed for Congress to pass that act, given your point that most of the presidents in the early life of the nation came from slaveholding states. I wouldn't have thought they would be able to muster the votes in Congress to pass the 1808 provision banning the importation of slaves.
One theory that's been offered by the historians is that the slave population in the South had grown to sufficient level that they no longer needed importation. And so we can
an issue.
Well, we can use it to negotiate something else that the slave-owning states want. So it's an easy chip on the table.
Other questions? You give such concise answers. This is remarkable. Okay, here we are.
Can you suggest any good books?
I'll give you your $5 afterwards because that's where I wanted to go next. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, a colorful, readable, but highly opinionated commentary on the Constitution as a whole is by my colleague, Michael Paulson. And he has a specific chapter on the crisis of the Civil War. He is a Lincoln expert. He teaches a seminar, an honors seminar at the university in Lincoln, and it's called The Constitution, an Introduction. Michael Stokes Paulson and Luke Paulson. Again, he is very opinionated, but it is designated that way, and it's very readable. It's something that I have had high school students in honors classes read and find it very engaging. And so I would recommend that. It's called The Constitution, an Introduction.
Is it Paulson with an E or Paulson with an O?
With an E. And he wrote it actually with his son, Luke Paulson. So it is published by Basic Books. All right.
And if I could say, if anybody reads Michael Paulson's book, could you give me a book review? Because Michael Paulson is one of the people that I have really would like to invite
engage in this
to address this group. So I will check. I hope so.
And then the second book that I would recommend, just because it's one of my favorites and has caused a lot of people to understand the judiciary differently, particularly given the current controversies concerning our federal judiciary, is Justice Accused. Justice Accused. It is a wonderful book about how can decent men sit on the bench and send human beings back into slavery. It's an analysis on the moral obligations of a judge. When the positive law, okay, now I'm going to really sound like I teach at a Catholic university. When the positive law violates the natural law, how is it that decent men and now women can actually rule to send someone back into that horrific institution when they have it within their power to simply rule against the petitioner in that case? It's a wonderful book. It is a book that has a lot of moral philosophy, but I don't think it's a book. Half the time, I suspect some of you will be spitting nails as you read, but he's so engaging that you'll turn the page to see what next outrageous thing he says. This book, Justice Accused, is not written in that tone. And it's an important question because we had the same question, of course, during the Nazi war. How can good men and women.
Did
It's
you
called
say
Justice Accused.
The author.
And of course, it flew through my mind, but Robert Cover. Thank you. That's right. It's a wonderful book, and I recognize it. And it introduces you to a couple of concepts that I talk to my students a lot about, which is the difference between being a conscientious objector and being conscientious objectors are people in both philosophical theory and political theory. It's an individual who, through their own unjust suffering, hopes to move the conscience of the community to change the law. So there's an unjust law like blacks can't sit at the front of the bus. And the person makes a conscious decision to violate the law, knowing that penalties will be imposed, expecting that penalties will be imposed, even wanting penalties to be imposed, so that the unjust sentence will be so clear to the community that they will change the law. That's conscientious objection. Conscientious abstention is a second concept. It is the concept of an individual who has no intention of violating the law. They just hope to avoid the law. All right? They don't want to be forced to engage in the law that requires, and I'm going to give a controversial example, but the Catholic hospital that doesn't want abortions provided, right? They're not out there seeking, well, they're not directly seeking to change the law in that way. They just don't want to be involved, okay? It's an unjust law. Just leave us alone, and we'll go our merry way and provide all other forms of health care. In that instance, the conscientious abstainer then, in responding to the unjust law when it is forced upon them, has to make a choice. And it's a different political calculation. And the reason I talk about it with law students is that there are some instances where lawyers will encounter that. For example, in some of the states that have assisted suicide, if you are an estate planner, if you believe that morally objectionable, are you required to draft it for your client? A directive to that effect? Or can you simply say, I can't help you with that, but I have other lawyers who can? It's the masterpiece cake problem, those of you who are up on that. At what point, when you're forced to take a stand, and should the law treat those two differently? So, Robert Cover, wonderful book, doesn't address contemporary questions in that sense, but gives you a great background about good abolitionist judges who stayed on the bench, even with the fugitive slave law. Interesting book.
I think we have time for one more question. We end at 2:30. Does anybody? Yes, great. We got one more question.
No more numbers questions. No, I've proven inadequate on that.
This is going to be a mistake to give this to me. Do you have any comment about the hearing on Monday, the Kavanaugh hearing?
I think we're all very interested in the outcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And thank you, Professor Collett. One thing, typically we get somebody up here, the first question takes up half the question period, and the first response, so you